Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Welcome to the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University and our weekly research seminar. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the interim co-director for social sciences here at CSAC. It's a great pleasure to be hosting the meeting today and to introduce Dr. John Emery, who will be talking to us about his research, Moral Choices Without Moral Language, 1950s Wargaming at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Emery is a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow here at CSAC at Stanford. He received his PhD in political science from the University of California, Irvine, and was a Tobis Fellow at the Interdisciplinary Center for the Scientific Study of Ethics and Morality at the same university. He focuses on security studies, ethics of war, and science and technology studies. He's currently looking and exploring issues of human-machine interaction in the U.S. national security context, looking at both historical and contemporary cases. We'll be hearing about some of his research today on wargaming. Without much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Emery. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of his talk. And since we're in a webinar format, please go ahead and enter your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom at any time. You'll see a button on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom window. Dr. Emery, over to you.
Thank you so much, Harold. So when a lot of us think about the RAND Corporation, I think we tend to have a very caricatured view of what's going on, right? We tend to think of it as kind of an amalgamation of lots of Dr. Strangeloves, especially in the early years in the 1950s. Indeed, in 1961, the folk singer Malvina Reynolds recorded a song called the RAND Hymn, in which he described the work of the RAND Corporation scientists with the following lyrics. Oh, the RAND Corporation, the boon of the world, they think all day long for a fee. They sit and play games about going up in flames. For counters, they use you and me, honeybee. For counters, they use you and me. So you can see this kind of view that these are kind of cold, calculating, rational kind of game theoreticians playing with nuclear weapons for fun, especially in a wargaming context, not really thinking about the ethics and morality of what's going on at the time. You know, they were known by some as the Wizards of Armageddon or the thermonuclear Jesuits, part of the nuclear priesthood. So what I wanted to do when I went into the RAND Corporation archives was really understand the kind of origins and the site of Cold War knowledge production, how we came to know what we know about deterrence, game theory, and nuclear brinksmanship throughout the Cold War. And what I found wasn't this kind of technostrategic groupthink going on, but rather an immense contestation that especially played out in the 1950s between the mathematics division and the social sciences division, and something that they called the Cold War game. And so a little bit of an overview for my talk today. First, I'm gonna go through Carol Cohen's concept of technostrategic language, how it kind of shapes my understanding and my foray into the archives at RAND. Then I'm gonna talk about the origins of political military gaming. It was in the mid-1950s at RAND that they really started to think about integrating things like politics, psychology, and economics into kind of traditional military gaming. And this played out in the Cold War game in kind of two versions of it. The first one was by the mathematics division, and the second one was by the social sciences division. And you really see here a comparative analysis that I'm going to tackle on how two kind of divergent epistemologies and understanding the world led to really different outcomes in their war games. And then I'm going to round out the talk today in a discussion of ethics and emotion and how that plays into the concept of wargaming and kind of how we can use it for thinking through contemporary dilemmas today. So Carol Cohen, in her 1986 article, Sex and Death in the World of the Defense Intellectual, that came out in Science, she did a participant observation study of nuclear defense intellectuals where she noticed something strange going on there. They were using something that she termed technostrategic language. It was that when they were talking about nuclear weapons, they really constructed an abstract world. something that is inherently gendered, that humanizes the weapons and excludes human suffering from the conversation, right? In order to be considered a nuclear expert, to raise issues such as possibilities of accidents or civilian casualties from the use of nuclear weapons was viewed as inexpert, emotional, not the essence of what they were trying to tackle. So she was somewhat amazed that these defense intellectuals could casually discuss killing millions of people in a total nuclear war between the US and Soviet Union with no sense of horror, no sense of urgency, or moral outrage at what they were doing. And so what these defense intellectuals did was set the parameters of what was considered legitimate debate. So she gives us the example of kind of limited nuclear war. Now, a limited nuclear war, thankfully, has never taken place, and thus it remains entirely theoretical. And what she saw in the late 80s at the end of the Cold War was these defense intellectuals really constructing this world that was hermetically sealed, right? Where perfectly rational actors are calculating megatonnage of how to respond, the assumption of perfect information that we would know with what size nuclear bomb we were attacked. There would be no domestic political pressure, no emotion. So this kind of cold calculating rational actors. So what I wanted to do at RAND was really trace the origins of how we came to think this way at the end of the Cold War. And so I was left with this puzzle as I started to dig into the archives and look at this thing called the Cold War game. That although everyone's using this kind of technostrategic language to some varying degree, in the social science game in particular, you see a lot of nuclear restraint, right? They refuse to press the button and launch nuclear weapons. So even in a simulated game environment, there's this kind of nuclear restraint that you don't see in these kind of casual conversations or publications. So I wanted to explore that through this lens of the Cold War game at RAND. So in the mid-50s, all the RAND scientists from kind of all divisions were trying to think through how do we integrate things like politics and economics into traditional wargaming, right? They recognized that nuclear weapons were different than traditional war because it was a very political game. And so they developed something that they affectionately termed the COW, which was an abbreviation for the Cold War game, and tried to integrate those in kind of varying ways. MAD here is actually the mathematical analytics division, not mutually assured destruction. And what they sought to do in their game was to be able to quantify all of the elements of the social world, to be able to predict what US strategies would do in the real world. Whereas the social science division, abbreviated SSD, in contrast, was really trying to figure out the exercise of judgment. What is the psychology of decision-making here? How do you integrate things like history, politics, and culture in a way that isn't necessarily predictive in any way, but allows us to better understand the world in new and more complex ways? And so I titled this section A Mad Game to Play, and it really looks at the mathematical analytics division war games. So they really viewed wargaming at the time as a substitute for experimentation. They kind of really epitomized what Carol Cohen was talking about in her technostrategic language. These were systems analysts and early game theoreticians thinking about kind of nuclear war in this context. So Olaf Helmer, one of the designers of this original game, said, quote, "Whenever we are wargaming some aspect of military warfare, we're doing so as a substitute for experimentation. Actual experimentation, which would involve, for instance, dropping of bombs on armies and factories, is of course impossible. So we set up a model situation which, by way of numerous analogs, simulates the real situation as closely as possible." So with this kind of mentality, they went in to design this wargame to predict consequences of theoretical US strategy with mathematical precision and certainty. So within the game, you could make economic, political, and military moves, right? For economic moves, they manipulated kind of 5 central commodities, as well as talking about trade, et cetera. For political moves, you could do things, they accounted for things such as, an overthrow of a government or issuing threats, et cetera. And military action included both conventional and nuclear attacks. And so in doing this, as you can see, trying to quantify the entire world, they had to make a lot of simplifying assumptions and assume down a lot of the complexity of the world into variables that they could easily manipulate and wouldn't make the game too complicated. their idea was ultimately to eliminate judgment from coming in. They would use a chance device by rolling dice, and they figured that with enough iterations, they could get to the heart of what strategies would work in what contexts. And what's very interesting is that even though this was taking place in 1954, they had an interesting view of computers at the time, and they essentially viewed humans as computers. So Olaf Helmer again said, the human participating in the game acts something like an analog computer, in the sense that he takes the place of a black box, into which his artificial environment feeds certain stimuli, to which he reacts behaviorally by producing strategic decisions, right? So all of us social scientists, and especially the psychologists watching, may be pulling out our hair and saying, what are you thinking? That's not at all how humans think and act, right? But those were the assumptions going into this game. Furthermore, historian Christian Day talks about Alexander Mood, one of the other designers of this game, who believed that, quote, modern high-speed computers will enable the number of factors which can be included in a game to be increased tremendously, if necessary, without adding complexity to the game from a player's standpoint. The computer can make a host of minor decisions on the basis of certain general instructions from the players, right? So you already see this kind of technological problem solving at work here, that humans are analog computers, and if we just put in enough variables, computers will eventually solve the problem and tell us what's going on. So how did the mathematical analytics division war game play out? Well, in one of the iterations of the game, both the US and the Soviet Union threw hydrogen bombs very early on in the game, and then a hypothetical Middle East player took over the Soviet Union, right? So not a very accurate representation of reality, but you can see here from the archival documents how they calculated the effects of a hydrogen bomb attack. They had things like capital losses, population losses, and military losses. You know, if it's your first attack, you lose a certain percentage. If you are attacked for a second time, you lose a greater percentage, right? So you can see how they put everything, all of the uncertainty of the possibility of doomsday, into neat mathematical calculations. Somehow you can take all of this uncertainty, and with the methods of systems analysis and game theory, that you can somehow create a more scientific way of war. But as Daniel Ellsberg talks about, at this point in time, we pretty much already had enough nuclear weapons for a doomsday scenario. So although they claimed to be objective in their calculations, they were making a lot of simplifying assumptions that turned out not quite to be true when you look at the actual kind of empirical record after the fact. And so needless to say, the social scientists were pissed at the mathematicians. Right? They essentially created a spite game. For those of you that watched the most recent season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, when Larry David created his spite store of Latte Larry's, that's what the social scientists did to the mathematical analytics division. They created a spite game, also called affectionately the cow, or the Cold War game. So a big thanks here to Daniel Bessner, a historian who wrote on one of the early social scientists at RAND Corporation, Hans Speer. He was instrumental in helping me kind of tease out the discrepancies in the archives, because they were both calling two different things the cow. So a big thanks to him here. And so the social scientists really viewed what the mathematicians were doing as beyond ridiculous, right? As Bessner argues, the social science division Cold War game endorsed the idea that political life by definition was unquantifiable. This didn't mean they rejected rationalism, but rather they argued that by reproducing the irrational dynamism of international politics, the political simulation was a heuristic that was actually more scientific than Rand's other models and methods, right? They said that the other game lacked a sense of realism. You couldn't actually make any political moves. Everything was done out in the open, and they assumed away all the complexity of humanity, right? Its design was entirely ridiculous. Culture, psychology, politics, and emotions, all of which were unquantifiable, unformalizable, and unpredictable, were what mattered in international relations. And the social scientists wanted to tackle this by creating a game with a high degree of realism to really understand the human element and the group dynamics and the unpredictability of international relations. And they did this through a desire to understand the exercise of judgment, not necessarily to get answers like the mathematical division. So the social scientific cow was based on a model of free play with secretive moves. So the reason that they wanted to have free play in essence, was to really understand the nature to which government teams were not limited to any prescribed set of moves. As is the case, like in the game of chess or some other war games, the game did not contain any pre-established prescriptions, automatically entailing certain consequences from particular types of moves. There was a real recognition here by the designers like Hans Speer and Paul Keksmedi that you really needed to understand the world, and that in all social sciences, no matter how quantified you made it, these correlations that we establish amongst phenomenon, the basic data themselves is always subject to interpretation and hence judgment, right? So we all know this. Whenever we operationalize variables, we make certain assumptions about the world. So in this game, the players would make secretive moves that they would hand off to the referees. And the referees then would leak some information, sometimes all of it, sometimes misinformation, and sometimes partial information by which the other teams would make decisions. It took place over 4 rounds of play. The first 2 were really just trying to tease out how the game would look. The 4th round was the most intensive. It had dozens of players devoting full time to a nearly 2-week war game exercise. So we have a really good kind of documentary record of what went on in this game. And so they really tried to establish the ways in which a high degree of realism was essential to understanding the world and really contextualizing the unique moment that they were in. And there's a great example of the high degree of realism which took place here when they were talking about the kind of French team. So there was a maddening frustration with the French team caused by the US players. As one of the architects, Goldson, detailed, the instability of French commitments and the fluctuating composition of its government made the life of the US team, as in reality, a frustrating one. The game succeeded in reproducing almost too well the tensions, divergencies, and shakiness of the NATO alliance, right? So you get all the intricacies and the messiness of this, that when you're trying to understand a contest between the US and Soviet Union, you also need to understand the kind of individual domestic context. So the social scientists really relied on area experts to play all the divisions. So you had a Sovietologist playing the USSR team, American politics experts playing the US team, and European experts playing a kind of collective European team. But how do you account for things like uncertainty? They created something called the Committee on Nature, which would inject a lot of uncertainty into the play of the game. So the role of nature was to provide for events of the type that happen in the real world, but are not under any control of the government. Certain things like technological developments, the death of important people, non-governmental political action, famines, popular disturbances, etc. There was a real recognition by some of the creators of this game, like Herbert Goldhammer and Hans Speer, that the Committee on Nature could account for the unpredictability of international politics. They said, quote, "In political life, many events are beyond control of even the most powerful actors, a fact designated in political theories by terms such as fortuna, chance, God's will, or changes in the natural environment." We tried to simulate this fact by the moves of nature in this game simulation. Another architect of this game, Goldson, eloquently noted that no government is absolutely free to impose its will on the world. All operate under some constraints. All must operate with incomplete information about the present and the future. And all must expect the unexpected to interfere with their best laid plans. World political history is replete with examples of Pyrrhic victories, and conversely, with situations thought to be defeats at the time, which turned out to be blessings in disguise. So how to allow for such considerations in evaluating real or game simulated political developments is a formidable problem indeed. So you can see how the social scientists were really grappling with these types of questions, and how the exercise of judgment played in under conditions of uncertainty and misinformation. They really captured the dynamics of decision-making in group play, which actually led to nuclear restraint, right? In this particular game, they never launched nuclear weapons, right? They really actually, unlike the mathematicians, weren't quick to press the button. So you have a kind of contrast between these two epistemological approaches. On the one side, the mathematicians are offering answers. The social scientists are offering questions. They're grappling with the complexity of the social world, with fortune, and trying to get an accurate representation of psychology, group dynamics, and how history impacts decision-making under all of these uncertainties. So you get these two divergent outcomes, one of hydrogen bombs, one of nuclear restraint. And what I want to highlight from the social sciences division especially is that they really felt a sense of crushing responsibility. They really realized the weight of decision making, and that it wasn't so much casually you can talk about hurling nuclear weapons. So although both sides engaged in technostrategic discourse and technostrategic language, the mathematicians more, they ended with divergent outcomes. There was something about the realism of the game that really led to nuclear restraint, a kind of emotional intelligence, and I would say a kind of ethics of practical judgment, which once the game started to proliferate beyond the RAND Corporation to MIT, to the State Department, and beyond, really had a lasting impact on international politics. And so just to quote the kind of summation of the game from W.P. Davidson, but most of all, the players quickly gained a sense of the awful consequences that might result from an ill-advised move. In the game, as in the real world, international relations were conducted under the shadow of terrible destructiveness of modern weapons. Participants acquired a sense of crushing responsibility, and for this reason, the game was sometimes very exhausting. As a result of this sense of responsibility, players often tended to be extremely cautious. Those who in the classroom or in publications may have advocated bold, imaginative policies and criticized free world leaders for their timidity usually found themselves behaving with equal caution when they assumed the burden of policymaking in the game. So participants thus tended to judge foreign policy decisions in the real world differently after the game than they had done before it. So there's something here that is kind of intangible, but it's something about the process of physical play that really tempered even the most bellicose players. And Aaron Trammell, who does work on kind of a history of wargaming, notes that this particular game has a recognition that strategic decisions are not only analytic, they're also emotional. And any real analysis must take into account the moods produced by war, in addition to its geographies and technologies. And so this kind of emotional intelligence or ethical intuition really plays out in kind of interesting ways, especially as this game proliferated. So W.P. Davidson went from the RAND Corporation to MIT and ran these similar types of political military games, which were then picked up by Lincoln Bloomfield in the mid-1950s at MIT. This, of course, is the object of study in Reed Pauly's 2018 International Security article, where he looks at the dynamics of 26 games from 1958 to 1964. And he similarly found a real hesitancy to press the button amongst the simulated game environment. He found that the reasons that the players gave comport most strongly with the logics of deterrence, practicality, and reputation, and there was no evidence of ethical arguments. So ethics was really excluded as de facto non-rational discourse throughout these games. And so I think what my game and the MIT games that Pauly studied really demonstrates is that even though what Carol Cohen argued kind of held true even at the beginning, that you didn't really have an overt discussion of ethics, ethics kind of creeped in a way throughout the process of play. So Pauly notes that in 2 of the games, they actually did go nuclear. And one of the participants, after going nuclear, somberly reflected that it's sobering and disturbing to realize that a handful of men in the United States and Soviet Union can decide the fate of hundreds of millions, including many not in either country. Lincoln Bloomfield himself stated that the game was so engaging and immersive that leaving the game was like coming out of a deep sleep after a particularly vivid dream. It takes time for the carryover of the emotional content of the game to wear off. And in one of the games at MIT that Davison ran, he said that there was a staunch student who was a supporter of the Democratic Party who said, "For the first time in my life, I sympathize with John Foster Dulles." Right? And so you can see here that technostrategic language still plays out, but there's something about the process of play that engages our kind of ethical intuitions in a way that, writing about it or kind of more abstract games like the mathematics division at RAND didn't really do. And I think emotions are really important here. And Valerie Markavicic, in an article, Tin Men Ethics, really tackles this well in the Journal of Military Ethics. She talks about how emotions can help us to act morally by informing our moral intuition, generating empathy, and holding us accountable for our choices. Our emotions, as expressions of our inner soul and conscience, actually guide us toward more ethical behavior. So I think the idea, and these games I think are so interesting because they really highlight the idea that the more and more we try and exclude emotion from our analysis, the more we get away from the way that humans actually act in the world and the way that we think about politics. And there's a lot going on here in terms of engaging our ethical intuitions and how that may lead to restraint in ways that I think should be explored further. So some kind of broad implications and conclusions of this is that the social science division game, they were kind of relegated to the margins at the RAND Corporation, right? We know game theory kind of won out and computerized wargaming became prominent throughout RAND. So they were relegated to the margins of history, but the way the game proliferated was one of their most lasting impact on both the theory and practice of international relations. So I think it's useful to kind of understand the dynamics that went on and the contestations at RAND to really understand this. There's a real weight to decision making that I think is important to feel, and we should try to integrate in our analyses in the best way we can. And wargaming is one way to do that. I'm really grateful that today there's kind of a so-called renaissance in wargaming taking place today to really tackle these kind of novel dilemmas that don't have an empirical basis. Things like AI, crisis stability, drone warfare. A lot of people are doing really fantastic work on this through the methods of wargaming. I think it's important to highlight the kind of limits of discourse as well, especially for those of us doing historical work, right? Even though they don't talk about ethics explicitly, it can still bubble up in interesting ways. And so I think it's worth looking at the silences of the archives as much as it is kind of looking at the actual discourse of what is said, because just as we are, they are limited in what is considered common knowledge at the time. And what is considered common knowledge evolves, changes, and is contested over time. There's something important going on with abstraction here, especially in the early dynamics at the RAND Corporation. The more realism you can bring to your game, the kind of more interesting integration you get of ethics and emotions. And I think there's important parallels here, which is the next paper I'm kind of working on about AI in the future of warfare. In the 1950s, you were dealing with kind of new novel technologies with nuclear weapons and new methods of study with the birth of game theory. And today we're trying to tackle a somewhat unknown future of war. Right? And so I think we can look to this kind of historical moment to see how others thought through these dilemmas, where they were right, where they were wrong, to kind of help us inform our understanding of the future of war today. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to Harold for questions. If we don't get to everyone today, go ahead and feel free to shoot me an email. But Harold, over to you to field the Q&A.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, John. And I'll go over to Q&A now. As I mentioned in chat, please go ahead and enter your questions in the Q&A function. I'll give the first few questions to our CSAC fellows, as is the usual CSAC custom. So I'm going to start out with Stephen Bono and then go to Jill Hazelton, followed by Edward Geist. Stephen S. It says, great talk. You sure know how to put a slideshow together. Looking at the background of John's photo of Lincoln Bloomfield on the chalkboard, he wrote, wisdom versus knowledge and data versus information. Is your story not really an indictment of quantitative methods, a numbers approach versus social political approach? Does that feel weird to you as a political scientist whose field is increasingly quantitative as the years go by?
Yeah, so I don't want to indict my quantitative friends too much. I think that, especially in this case, as they were trying to tackle it, it is a bit of an indictment of the quantitative approach. I think that it gives us a kind of false sense of certainty and security. We want to have the numbers, right? It gives us a sense that we can control the unpredictableness of human life, and especially when it comes to war games or war in international politics. There's this kind of great uncertainty there that we want to kind of grasp onto. And so, so thinking through this, I think that quantitative methods in some ways are perfect for some questions, but not for others. And I think especially for moral questions that we're trying to answer can lead us astray in a few ways. And I think more importantly, what we recognize from especially a lot of these early assumptions is that the assumptions that you write into your operationalization of variables lead you to certain types of conclusions. And as Lynn Eden's work, The Whole World on Fire, kind of really notes quite well that up until the 80s and 90s, we weren't including things like fire damage in our calculations of casualties from nuclear weapons, right? So that was something that was kind of omitted from discussion. And so it led you astray to give you a false sense of the security of numbers. And so I think Lincoln Bloomfield is right that we need to understand wisdom is something important and that information is sometimes rife with our assumptions. And I think it's important to acknowledge it, even if you want to go down that quantitative path.
Thanks. The next question is from Professor Jill Hazelton at the Naval War College, who's also a visiting scholar at CSEC this year. She asks, is there any evidence that the MAD group felt the psychological need to distance themselves from the politics of international interactions because of the nearly unimaginable horror of nuclear use?
Yeah, so I don't have any evidence of that. And so there's one limitation when it comes to the MAD study. I'm left with kind of bits and pieces of breadcrumbs in the archival record. They actually recorded all of the sessions. And while I was there, they had the recordings, but they're on 1954 recording film. So no one has a means to actually sit down and listen to them. If I can find it, I will go back and spend weeks in the archives transcribing it. But at this point in time, there's no kind of evidence from what I can find that they did this from a need to kind of distance themselves psychologically. They were really kind of what Fred Kaplan talked about. They were rational actors trying to make reasonable something that seemed inherently irrational, which is nuclear war. So I think they kind of epitomize the Wizards of Armageddon, that they didn't really think about or grapple with this in quite the same way as a social scientist. But, RAND Corporation was not a monolith. Kind of each individual actor surprised me in different ways. And as I got to know them through the archives and understanding some of their biographies, some of them were far more ethically reflexive than I might have imagined they would be than my caricature understanding.
And just as an aside, and actually Jill Hazelton also mentioned this, you might even want to say what medium was used to record these games in case there's an expert in the audience who actually might know where you can lay your hands on a player. In fact, Professor Hazelton suggests checking with the Smithsonian, which I know archives playback devices to be able to access older mediums. Moving on to a question from Edward Geist at the RAND Corporation. He says, these games are held around the time that the Social Sciences Division shifted from being isolated in the DC RAND office to being integrated into the Santa Monica campus. Could you say more about where the social science games were hosted? And just to follow up to Ed's questions, did that make a difference for how the games were organized or took place or otherwise influenced what was going on?
Yeah, so the fourth round of play did take place. It was viewed as kind of like a summer camp at the Santa Monica location. So I think the first two rounds took place at the DC location and trying to figure out how they would actually design the game. There was just a couple of days. The real kind of serious round where they devoted tons of secretarial staff and 2 weeks of full-time play took place at Santa Monica. And there's some really interesting dynamics going on here. And I think Fred Kaplan kind of best highlights it. Each one viewed the other between mathematics and social scientists as doing kind of pseudoscience, right? There was a big kind of infighting between the quants and the quals, much like we still have today. And so they often viewed some with disdain when they were talking about the methods of the others. They would say that the mathematicians would say that the social scientists were using methods from the 1700s, things like that. So they weren't actually doing science, whereas the social scientists were contesting, we're actually more scientific than you because you guys make a lot of bad assumptions about the world. So I think there's a big kind of intergroup dynamic there, which is worth exploring and is a fun story to tell, but I pretty much had to cut it all from the paper. So thanks, Ed.
So the next question I think is very apropos from Rose Gottemuller, I think follows directly on this recent discussion. Rose Gottemuller comments, because the computers won out, quote unquote, and the political scientists were pushed to the margins at RAND. Does that explain how little has changed in nuclear wargaming today?
So I think perhaps. So there was one example of a computerized war game in 1961. It was called A Simulation of Total Atomic Global Exchange. They ran months and months worth of ticker tape of calculations through the computer to definitively prove at the end, after months of running this, that the US would unequivocally win a total nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, right? But as I think any war gamer will tell you, and anyone who actually tackles these, is that any war game is only as good as its designer. And so whatever assumptions you put into the game and what you're trying to achieve from that game will vary. And so you can pretty much get outcomes that you want. You can be pushed toward kind of nuclear use. You can be kept away from nuclear use. But I think from those that I've talked to that participated in many war games, they do seem quite tired in a lot of ways. And so that's why I was so intrigued by this social science game in the 1950s, is because it really gets at a lot of these elements, that there's kind of a real value to wargaming for wargaming's sake, especially if you have a high degree of realism, to kind of understand and almost practice the ways in which you might act under conditions of uncertainty and cultivate this kind of emotional intelligence.
Thank you. So the next question is from Noel Peratt at the Carnegie Corporation in New York. And I'll tag onto her question using moderator's privilege. She says, fascinating presentation. Can this research tell us anything about the recent revelations about US military leaders considering a nuclear strike against China in 1958 to protect Taiwan? To which I would add, to what extent were these games seen as being relevant to present-day, strategic problems that could answer a question like that, for example, about whether that made sense? To what extent was this framed as something that could be used to make recommendations versus just a way to think about a very difficult strategic problem?
Yeah. So perfect question, Noel. Thanks a lot for it. So I've been seeing that article circulate in my Twitter feed pretty much the past few days, but I've restrained from reading it in preparation for this presentation. So I can't answer directly to that question because I'm not up to speed on what's going on with that in particular. But I think what's most interesting about this fourth round of play that I left out in the presentation is the fact that State Department actually participated in this war game. And they were emphatic about how much was learned from this particular instance. And so they wanted to integrate it into the State Department. So I'm just going to pull up and share my slide real quick that shows the kind of proliferation of the war game that I think might be helpful. So here Hans Speer brought it to the Social Science Research Council. They did it for the Center for Advanced Study. And in 58, the State Department really said that they wanted to integrate this type of wargaming into their analysis. Speer also presented at West Point. Herbert Goldhammer presented at the Army War College. Goldson promoted it at Yale and Princeton, and W. Phillips Davison took it to MIT, where Lincoln Bloomfield really picked it up and ran with it. So I think it did have some impact on especially the State Department. They were really excited about the game and what it kind of did for them. So to what extent it actually impacted policies, I think is an open question and one worthy of exploration. But the State Department people absolutely loved it at the time. Oh, Harold, you're muted. Yeah.
Thanks. You'd think after a year this wouldn't be an issue.
Struggles.
So the next question is from Benoit Pelopidas at Sciences Po. He says, this is an important argument in paper, John. Many thanks for doing this work. On your argument on the role of emotions, it sounds like your argument on the practice of gaming as possibly inducing restraint applies to preventing the first use of nuclear weapons. Once first use has happened, which might be accidental and not prevented by ethical reasoning, would you agree with Rose McDermott's 2017 article on the psychology of revenge and deterrence, in which she claims that revenge will guarantee retaliations once first use has happened?
Thanks so much, Benoit. You've really been fantastic. I sent him the paper a few days ago, and he's already given me back so many comments to kind of think through and going forward. I do think that the role of emotions is powerful and that it does need to take into account, something after first use, right? And that's one of the limitations of even the Committee on Nature thinking about the uncertainties, is they were still kind of limited in what was deemed as reasonable uncertainty. They didn't take into account accidental launch or nuclear accidents or really high amounts of misinformation, like systems misreading a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union, all of which empirically took place throughout the Cold War. And so I do think that it would be interesting when you're thinking about wargaming, how you kind of play out these psychologies of revenge from McDermott's Texas National Security Review article, that it doesn't necessarily guarantee retaliation. I know that Andrew Reddy in his Signal War games at UC Berkeley is really trying to tease out the idea of whether or not having a limited nuclear option changes your calculus. Of course, he uses a kind of very abstract model, 3 countries, purple, green, and blue, to kind of tease this out. But in over half of the cases, they do go nuclear, right? And so that's because he's really trying to tease out, kind of in a social scientific manner, the dynamics of whether or not having a limited nuclear option impacts whether or not you use nuclear weapons. So I think it's an open question and something that for the war gamers in the audience, anyone who wants to try and war game it, I'd be happy to join in and see what happens.
Great. And for those of you who've asked more than one question, I'm going to try to fit you in at the end, just so you know. I'm just trying to get to some of the other folks who have asked questions. So there's a couple questions about popular reactions to sort of the RAND Corporation and wargaming. So Paul Sappho asks, in 1963, Milton Caniff depicted a wargame exercise in a Steve Canyon comic strip, and everyone freaked out. Can you comment on the details of the public reaction and that of the Pentagon? And let me tag on, Kelly Hills asks, did the public have any clue these wargames were happening? And if so, how did they react?
Yeah, so great questions. Paul, if you could send me that comic strip, I'd be really interested in it. The public wasn't necessarily aware of these war games at the time, and I don't think they were very concerned with them, but I haven't really looked at the kind of public reaction to this. So anyone who wants to collaborate on it, I'd be happy to, but frankly, I just don't know at this point, but it's an interesting thought to look forward at.
So let me go to a question by Jeff Sherman, and then I also have questions from Asfandir Mir, Lynn Eden, Paul Edwards. We'll try to fit these all in. From Jeff Sherman, what do you make of contemporary war games where the conflict is envisioned as one being the US and China, where going nuclear is often excluded? And he gives as an example, RAND's newer hegemony game, which is spelled HEDGEMONY.
Yeah, so once again, I've seen that new game, and as soon as I get the research funds to purchase it, I'm going to purchase it and hopefully play with some students. And I think that's a mistake to kind of exclude nuclear weapons, right? I think we've gotten a little bit comfortable in the contemporary era with nuclear weapons in a way that we don't really feel them as pressing in a lot of ways as they did in the kind of early Cold War period. I think we've just kind of gotten used to them. If the pandemic has showed us anything, it's that we can quickly get used to a lot of death and a lot of things that would have been shocking long before. So I think you always need to take into account kind of the presence of nuclear weapons, but I also understand reasons why you would want to exclude it. Everyone designs games for different reasons, and you want to get different things out of it. I think oftentimes in some games, if you really want to focus on the nuclear issue, it really skews what may be a more strategic or even tactical level game. So it just depends on the kind of game design and what you're trying to achieve. But, as a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow, I'm interested in the games that tend to either go nuclear or have the nuclear option.
Thanks. So from Lynn Eden, thanks for this, John. I love the question you asked at the beginning of the chapter. How did defense intellectuals come to casually toss around rational theories of deterrence that included the deaths of tens of millions without finding it morally abhorrent? Could you boil down your answer to a sentence or two?
Oh, the tough question. I think my overarching ethical argument is that the more we abstract things, the easier it is to casually dehumanize and desensitize ourselves to the human element. So Paul Slovic in his work on psychology recognizes that the second you start talking about numbers of casualties, you really kind of gloss over in a way. So at least one way I tackle this in the classroom when I'm teaching Hiroshima and Nagasaki is I give them the estimated casualty counts, my students, 200,000 deaths. Then I share with them the narrative of someone who was injured in the Hiroshima attacks, really feeling what they felt, that kind of affective and emotional response. And it sends chills down my spine every time, and the same for the students. So I think one way that we get around this is really talking about the human element and discussing the kind of narrative and even poetry of those who lived through war, both soldiers and civilians. And so that's kind of how I tackle this issue. It's bringing back in the human element.
So the next question is from Paul Edwards, and he apologizes. He had some Zoom issues at the beginning, so he might have missed your initial comments on this. Okay, but he asked you to say more about how your study of 1950s wargaming relates to discussion of ethics of modern war and of military AI, which you alluded to in your conclusions. And sort of what do you mean by things like military AI and how it might be relevant to, or how wargaming might be relevant to this set of issues?
Yeah, so this is essentially the next direction of my paper. And I think they kind of bear a family resemblance to each other in the sense that the same epistemological problems that they were grappling with in the 1950s, how do we operationalize variables, especially accounting for the complexity of the social world? We're still facing those problems today. But I think a key difference is when we're talking about AI is that the notion of AI or the myth of AI gives us an even more false sense of security. The idea that AI is somehow of a higher rationality than human thinking, that is not prone to the same errors, biases, or emotion as human decision making. And so I think there's a useful parallel here that we can kind of draw some lessons learned and thinking about the ways in which AI is always already constitutive of human judgment, right? And that's the kind of social scientist critique of the mathematical analytics division, that you're not getting rid of judgment. You're just bearing it in the game design. Same thing here, we're just bearing it in the design of artificial intelligence systems. So my other work focuses on more contemporary war technologies like collateral damage estimation algorithms and different targeting algorithms. So it's trying to link my kind of two disparate research topics.
Great.
Thanks.
So the next question is from CSAC postdoctoral fellow Asfandir Mir. He asks, what if international humanitarian law and law of armed conflict were salient then as they are today? Put it another way, how would ethical restraint have played out under the overhang of international humanitarian law and law of armed conflict?
Yeah, I think, thankfully we have a lot better view and discussion of IHL and ethics of war today than we did back then. After the horrors of World War II, many of the social scientists, especially at RAND, and the scientists at RAND escaped Europe either before or after the war as well. So they were used to a lot of killing and dying in war, right? At least understanding that kind of context. And we can view it with a lot more empathy looking back at it. So I think today there's a lot greater discussion of ethics of war. So I was fortunate a few weeks ago to play a RAND Corporation war game with both military and civilian people that Carl Mueller ran, and it was a fantastic game. And it was great because it really showed me to the extent to which especially military thinking has evolved on these issues, that IHL and those issues were kind of very front and center. And so we're always thinking about the laws of war, laws of armed conflict, and to some extent the ethics of war. So thankfully, it's become more salient today, even though it wasn't ever mentioned anywhere in the archives back then, even though it was the kind of birth of the Geneva Conventions. They just didn't think through it at all.
So actually, this is a very apropos question from Jill Hazelton, which follows on your comments just now, which she says, can you say more about contemporary wargaming and its utility? And she says, the reason she's asking is because of a concern that you mentioned in your talk, that the assumptions behind variables lead to certain types of answers and not others.
So there's a lot of great people working on these issues today. So I just wanted to, let's see, just wanted to highlight that. So there's a great paper out there right now by Eric Lynn Greenberg, Reed Pauly, and Jackie Schneider, available on SSRN, Wargaming for International Relations Research. And they give a number of kind of propositions for why we should take wargaming seriously today. So wargames are more immersive than other methods, so they're more externally valid. You get a more representative sample. So it's not necessarily just using students as your sample. You often get to use elite participants. You get a better group interaction and dynamics, so it's more representative of real world decision making. And their fourth proposition, that war games present players with consequences, so creating more valid data about decision making. So I think that the way they're tackling it and some of the others, especially at the RAND Corporation, like Ellie Bartels, are really kind of taking wargaming in new and important directions today. So I'm hopeful that those of us who are studying these type of both historical events and epistemology of wargaming more generally can help to inform contemporary wargames to make them as accurate as possible, but also to get out of it what we need to, which is understanding the consequences and the uncertainty of the international system.
Terrific. A question here from CSAC fellow Ryan Musto. And he's following on Noel's question, but basically, how did or what specific events, if any, of the 1950s changed or altered the conclusions of the wargamers? Did the way the Cold War was the progression of the Cold War from year to year affect the nature of the wargames themselves?
Yeah, so this was perfect question, Ryan. So this was actually a real problem that took place in the first couple of rounds of the war game at the DC branch, is that they found that contemporary events kept injecting themselves into the war game. And so what they did by the fourth round of the game was project it a few years into the future, so that people weren't necessarily influenced by all of the craziness that was going on and they were reading in the news every day. And so I think that was an important element to maintain a high degree of realism, was that quick kind of projection into the future in understanding this war game.
Thanks. Question from Gregory Olson. So he says, Jim Fearon in his article in the Rationalist Explanations of War double-clicked on the idea that there are incentives to dissemble in strategic interaction. Did either team at RAND model that challenge back in the 1950s?
So apologies to Jim Fearon if he's on the call, but I haven't read that article since my comprehensive exams and my PhD. So I'm not quite sure exactly how to answer that. However, I will say that there was one thing in the social science game in the fourth round that was really fascinating, that the Soviet Union decided to pursue a kind of peaceful initiative. So they were talking a game of peace, and it really threw the US into a tizzy, because they assumed that the Soviet Union would be very aggressive in a lot of its stances. And it was especially problematic for the NATO alliance, in this sense. A lot of the European players were accurately representing the conflict within Europe, and the Europeans were starting to realize that if a nuclear war pops off, we're the ones who are going to be most affected by it. So it really called into question a lot of the fundamental assumptions that there's a lot of ways in which it helped them think through problems that they didn't know could have been problems. So there's a lot of unique elements of strategic interactions that can come out if you do have especially area experts and really intelligent people kind of working in this war game environment.
Thanks. And we just have a couple more minutes, and we have one more question. So I think we're going to be able to conclude right on time. Kelly Hills asks, you talk about the division between the mathematicians and the social scientists in these RAND war games in the 1950s. What expertise do you think has been left out of these games traditionally?
Yeah, so I think the real expertise that's been left out in a lot of ways is, of course, the humanities scholars, right? And especially in these games, they did have physicists that would play and consult as well. So they had a team of consultants, especially in the social sciences game, where they basically told them the feasibility of moves. It's like, okay, we do have that missile technology or we don't. So really understanding the kind of what was going on at the moment. So in addition to that, I think one of the biggest things that Carol Cohen highlights is that what's always excluded is those who actually suffer from nuclear weapons. And so, say what you will about the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but I think one thing that was really powerful about the ban treaty is the way in which they organized early on the kind of humanitarian conferences. So having those who are affected by nuclear weapons, either in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or those who do work like Togzan Casanova on those affected by Soviet nuclear tests as well, that really they have a voice in kind of understanding nuclear war. So it's those who have always been excluded and those who are most affected by nuclear weapons, even if it wasn't detonated in a military setting, but in test settings as well. And I believe Austin Cooper may have a talk coming up soon on that topic, at least of the French testing in Africa. So be sure to tune in for that.
And Austin is a predoctoral fellow here at CSAC, just for clarification. So Jeff Sherman actually concludes the Q&A portion, which I think a sentiment hopefully everybody shares, which he says, such a great presentation, John. Thank you for your talk today, and I'm so looking forward to the new work. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to Dr. Emery for an excellent talk. As he said, feel free to email him if you have additional questions or if you have some of the things to share that might actually contribute to his research. And hopefully you'll join us at future CSAC research seminars in the same date and time in the next coming weeks. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.